Hey folks, I'm back down at the bottom of our intro videos. I haven't done one with me on the screen for a while, so I decided to jump back in. So my notes are always down here. We are talking about the Renaissance in this module, and I know you know, right? I'm gonna say I know you think you know, but I know you have some images of what the Renaissance is, right? That 16th century. So that's what we're gonna talk about. First, we're gonna talk about why it's called the Renaissance. It's called the Renaissance because beginning with the Italians, and as well as the French, the English, the Germans, right? But the Renaissance actually is a period in time where contemporary Europeans saw that 1,000-year period from the fall of the Roman civilization to where they were now. So they really began to re-identify with ancient Greek and Roman text, writing, architecture, literature, is everything that was Greece and Rome. So they began to identify with that. And Renaissance actually is derived from a word that means to be reborn, right? To be reborn. So that's what we're talking about. We're going to talk about the rebirth of what the people in this period really think of as culture and class, right? So the Dark Ages had come and gone, the plague had come and gone. This is the first time in really more than 1,000 years that there were large-scale organized government. So that's what we're going to talk about when we talk about the Renaissance. So we're going to dive in. We're going to talk about, of course, I'm going to break the lecture up, but we're going to be talking about Italy, France, Germany. I'm going to put a little bit of the U.S. in there because we were just, folks was getting over to us then. So I'm going to put a little bit of the U.S. in there. And as always, we'll talk about we'll talk about the historical background, a little bit of each country. I'm not going to dig deep because I can go deep. We're going to talk a little bit about textile production. Of course, we're going to look at some garments, get some names, and then we'll talk about some of those ceremonial rites of passage items that we always talk about. Okay, so this is the first part of the narrated lecture. And of course, you're going to get a couple pieces going forward. So dive in. So this is where we start, right? In the intro, in the previous slide, I talked about the word Renaissance means to be reborn, and classical historians use that word. Writers at the time use that word, but really modern historians don't consider it really a rebirth. They just see it as a time of shift, right? We used that word in our discussion board last time, right? As a shift, right? They see it as a shift, just a transition, just a period where profound change was happening. And those medieval institutions, those really small, fiefdoms with the knights and a king, they fell away, and a new society and culture began to appear. So it's really just a time of transition from the medieval to the modern world. So if you look at this timeline that's here on the screen, you see it's back there in the 1300s, right? And we move through the 14 to the 1500s, and there definitely is a transition from one period to the other. And in Italy, the Renaissance began around the 14th century, and it ended about the 16th century. So again, I say we were only going to do one century, but we are going to do a little bit more, 14th and 16th century. So there is a specific difference in artistic style and dress and garments for that period, and that is part of the reason why this period is called the Renaissance. We're going to talk about a couple of different countries as we know them. I'm not going to call them civilizations. We're going to talk about a couple of different countries when we talk about the Renaissance. But we're going to start with Italy, and we're going to start with Italy particularly because their Renaissance, their rebirth, started a little bit earlier than some of the other countries we're going to talk about later. And dress and artistic expression and movement and change and shift, right? It doesn't really fit into neat, clearly defined time periods, right? So when we talk about these other countries we're going to talk about, when we talk about all these countries we're going to talk about, um, it begins and ends in different parts of the world. So, you know, most of Europe was changing in its, line of political, economic, artistic development, that were trends that started in the Middle Ages. So there is just a new perception of life had begun to emerge in Italy first in the late 14th, earliest 14th century, and then it spread to the rest of Europe. When we talked about the medieval period, we kind of didn't talk about Italy. Honestly, Italy had, fallen off the map with the remove of the Roman Empire to Constantinople and the growth of the Byzantine Empire and the strength of the Byzantine Empire. Um, we've kind of left Italy out, so we're going to go back and talk about Italy for a little bit, and for most of that period, so from that 400 to mid late 1400s, Italy was just different than the rest of Europe. And in the Middle Ages, when a lot of these urban centers were just developing in Northern European countries, Italy was still there. When we talked about the decline of the Roman Empire and the move to the Eastern Roman Empire with the Byzantine Empire, Rome didn't completely fall apart. Sicily didn't completely fall apart. Milan and Florence, these still were flourishing cities. They just weren't under that umbrella of the Roman civilization anymore, right? So in their last couple in the early Europe lecture, we didn't talk about Rome at all. Actually, in Byzantine we didn't either. We didn't talk about Rome at all, but Italy still was moving. Italy just didn't die, fall apart because the Roman civilization, the seat of Roman power moved east. So that's part of the reason why these cities had an earlier resurgence, because Italy, even though it had its roots in a rural society, they they did start develop that city state structure, that urban, wealthy, uh, you know, class of lords and nobles earlier than much of the rest of Europe. And that's why we're going to talk about Italy first. With all that said, with all with all that said, Italians earlier on, so in the late 14th, late four, well, the 14th, late 14th, 15th century, Italians for the most part, because of its geographical position in the Mediterranean Sea, they still did some trade. They still had men and women living in cities, and pretty much they enjoyed a higher standard of living than many other countries. And when European economic revival began to happen, Italy benefited first, in part because it had that stronger middle class, and it was still a trading partner with big ports in cities such as Venice. So when we talked about the Crusades, Crusaders made their way all the way back to Italy, and they brought provisions from their expeditions back to Rome, and to the Pope. So what that did, especially for those port cities, for Venice and Genoa, Venetians, they just had more wealth. Everything had to come through them first. So as a result, they had more they had more wealth, and money generated in the trade industry enrich those merchants and the rulers of those states. And when we talk about textiles in a minute, Italian merchants became, financiers and bankers and traders. And one of the biggest things they traded in was textiles. styles that developed during the Renaissance in art and architecture and music and literature and textile and clothing um, and philosophy still continue to this day to influence Western culture. And even now, Renaissance textile designs are often reproduced for fabrics for drapery or upholstery. They're copied for wallpaper designs. There, that style is still used in furniture, and um, even in the ideal of the cultured, learned person of many talents is known as a Renaissance man.